At the end of life, narcissists often don't fear death the most. They fear something else. They fear the silence from the people they thought would always stay. Because the scariest truth about a narcissist's life is not how they live, it's how many of them end up living their final years without the emotional loyalty they once demanded. And there is a psychological reason for this. If you have ever wondered what really happens when manipulation stops working, if you have ever asked yourself whether narcissists ever face consequences, if you have ever walked away and wondered what comes next for them, this may answer questions most people are afraid to ask. If this opened your eyes, subscribe right now. Like this video to help others understand these hidden patterns. Comment peace over control if you believe emotional health matters. Share this with someone healing from narcissistic relationships. Emotional isolation is often one of the most frightening and least discussed outcomes in the life pattern of a narcissistic personality, and it rarely happens suddenly. It is usually the result of decades of small relational fractures that slowly accumulate over time. At first, the narcissist may appear socially successful. They may have family around them, colleagues, acquaintances, and even admirers. From the outside, their life may not look lonely at all. But emotional isolation is not about how many people are around you. It is about how many people feel safe enough to be close to you. And this is where the real story begins. Narcissistic personalities often struggle to create emotional safety in relationships. Conversations may revolve around their needs, their opinions, their frustrations, and their expectations. Other people may feel heard only when they agree. Disagreement may be treated as disrespect. Emotional vulnerability from others may be dismissed, minimized, or even used later as a weapon in arguments. Over time, people begin to learn an unspoken rule. It is safer to stay guarded than open. This does not always lead to dramatic breakups or obvious conflicts. In many cases, people simply adjust their emotional distance quietly. They share less. They visit less. They explain less about their lives. They stop seeking advice. They stop expecting understanding. What remains is often a functional relationship rather than an emotional one. They may still call. They may still visit. They may still fulfill duties. But something important is missing: emotional trust. As people age, this difference becomes much more visible. Younger years are often filled with distractions, careers, raising children, building stability, social obligations. These distractions can hide emotional gaps. But later in life, when life naturally becomes quieter, the quality of relationships becomes much more important than the quantity. This is where many narcissists encounter something they never prepared for: people choosing distance not out of anger but out of self-protection. Adult children may remain respectful but emotionally cautious. They may limit conversations to safe topics. They may avoid sharing personal struggles because past experiences taught them they would receive criticism instead of comfort. Partners may become emotionally independent, no longer seeking validation because they learned it would not come. Friends may reduce contact because interactions feel draining rather than fulfilling. The narcissist often experiences this as abandonment or ingratitude. They may say things like, "After everything I've done, this is how I'm treated." But what they often cannot see is that relationships are not sustained by obligation alone. They are sustained by emotional experience. People remember how interactions made them feel. Did they feel respected? Did they feel heard? Did they feel accepted? Did they feel safe being imperfect? Or did they feel judged, corrected, controlled, or emotionally small? These emotional memories quietly shape distance over time. Another reason emotional isolation increases is because narcissistic behavior often prevents repair after conflict. In healthy relationships, conflict is followed by reflection, accountability, and sometimes apology. These repairs strengthen bonds, but narcissists often avoid accountability because it threatens their self-image. Without repair, small injuries never fully heal. Unrepaired moments accumulate like invisible cracks in a foundation. Eventually, people stop trying to fix things because they believe nothing will change. When hope for change disappears, emotional investment usually follows. What makes this especially difficult later in life is that emotional patterns become more rigid with age, not less. A person who spent 40 or 50 years avoiding emotional accountability rarely develops that skill automatically. At the same time, the people around them become less tolerant of emotional stress because they are also aging and protecting their own peace. Older adults often reach a stage where they ask a simple question: does this relationship bring calm or tension? And many begin choosing calm. This is why emotional isolation around narcissists often looks quiet rather than dramatic. It looks like shorter phone calls, less frequent visits, conversations that stay superficial, kindness without closeness. And perhaps the most painful part is this. Narcissists often sense this distance, but misinterpret it. Instead of seeing it as the result of emotional patterns, they may see it as betrayal, disrespect, or jealousy. This misunderstanding can lead to even more criticism or attempts to regain control, which unfortunately pushes people even further away. It becomes a cycle. Distance creates frustration. Frustration creates more difficult behavior. Difficult behavior creates more distance. And slowly, emotional isolation becomes the new normal. But the deeper psychological truth is not about punishment, it is about consequence. Relationships naturally move toward environments where emotional safety exists, where people can relax, where they do not feel evaluated every moment, where they can be human without fear. And when emotional safety is missing long enough, people do not always leave physically, they just stop arriving emotionally. That is the isolation many narcissists face, not empty rooms, but quiet rooms, not absence of people, but absence of warmth, not being completely alone, but realizing that the deepest parts of connection were never fully built. And perhaps the most sobering reality is this. Emotional isolation at the end of life is rarely created in the final years. It is usually built slowly across a lifetime of emotional patterns that were never examined, never softened, and never repaired. The collapse of a narcissist's carefully built false image is rarely loud or dramatic. It does not usually happen in one single moment where everything falls apart. Instead, it happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, like a mask that begins to crack after being worn for too many years. And for the narcissist, this may be one of the most psychologically frightening experiences they ever face. To understand this, you must first understand how important image is to a narcissistic personality. Their identity is often not built on who they truly are emotionally, but on how they are perceived. Respect, admiration, status, authority, and appearing strong often become the foundation of their self-worth. They may spend decades carefully shaping how others see them, being the smartest person in the room, the most successful, the strongest, the one who is always right. But maintaining an image requires constant reinforcement. It requires people who believe the story. It requires environments where their authority is not questioned. It requires access to situations where they can continue performing this identity, and time slowly removes these advantages. As life progresses, roles naturally change. Retirement may remove professional status. Aging may reduce physical presence or dominance. Social groups change. New generations emerge who are less impressed by titles and more focused on emotional intelligence. The stories that once created admiration may start sounding repetitive instead of impressive, and something very uncomfortable begins to happen. Validation decreases. Not necessarily because people become cruel, but because life naturally shifts focus. People become busy with their own families, their own health, their own challenges. Attention is no longer automatically given. Respect is no longer based on position alone. Influence must now come from character rather than authority. For someone whose identity depended on admiration, this can feel like disappearing. The narcissist may try to compensate. They may repeat past achievements more often. They may exaggerate stories. They may interrupt others to redirect conversations back to themselves. They may criticize younger generations to feel superior. They may remind family members of sacrifices they made decades ago. But these attempts often have the opposite effect. Instead of restoring admiration, they may create emotional fatigue in others, because people can usually sense when someone is trying too hard to be seen as important. Another difficult reality is that aging makes authenticity harder to avoid. When people are younger, activity can hide personality traits. Work, social events, responsibilities, and busy schedules can distract from emotional patterns. But later in life, when the pace slows down, personality becomes more visible. Who someone really is emotionally becomes harder to hide behind activity. And this is often when the false image begins to weaken. People who once tolerated difficult behavior because of dependency or hierarchy may no longer need to. Adult children become independent. Colleagues are no longer subordinates. Social interactions become optional rather than required. Without dependency, the narcissist loses one of their strongest tools: leverage. And without leverage, image alone cannot maintain influence. This is where something psychologically destabilizing can occur. The narcissist may start noticing they are not automatically deferred to anymore. Their opinions may be challenged. Their advice may not be followed. Their emotional reactions may no longer control the atmosphere of a room. For someone used to being the emotional center of every environment, this can feel like losing gravity, and often they do not understand why. Because from their perspective, they may believe they are the same person they always were. What they often cannot see is that people are no longer responding to the image. They are responding to the emotional experience. And emotional experience always wins over reputation in the long term. Another painful part of this collapse is the realization, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, that admiration cannot be forced. It can be requested. It can be demanded. It can be manipulated temporarily. But genuine respect is always voluntary, and voluntary respect is built on emotional consistency, not control. Some narcissists respond to this collapse with anger, some with bitterness, some with increased attempts to dominate conversations, some with victimhood, portraying themselves as unappreciated or misunderstood. And some experience something much quieter, confusion. Because when someone has spent a lifetime believing their value comes from appearing strong rather than being emotionally connected, they may reach a stage where they realize strength alone does not keep people close. Warmth does, safety does, kindness does, and these are muscles they may not have developed. The tragedy is not that the image collapses. The tragedy is that many narcissists never built a stable identity underneath the image. So when admiration decreases, they may feel empty rather than simply less praised. Because if your identity is built on being special, what happens when life starts treating you like everyone else? This is the quiet psychological crisis many narcissists face but rarely talk about. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the false image does not usually collapse because people attack it. It collapses because people slowly stop feeding it. Less attention, less reaction, less emotional energy. And without those things, the performance has no audience. What remains then is the person behind the performance. And for someone who never invested in emotional growth, this can feel like standing in front of a mirror without the mask they wore for decades, not knowing who they are without it. And that may be one of the most disturbing realities they ever face. Not the loss of admiration, but the realization that admiration was never the same thing as love. One of the most difficult transitions a narcissist often faces later in life is the gradual realization that control no longer works the way it once did. For much of their life, control may have been their primary way of maintaining stability in relationships. Control of conversations, control of decisions, control of emotional narratives, and sometimes even control through fear, guilt, or obligation. But aging has a way of quietly removing the tools that once made that control possible. This does not happen all at once. It happens in small, almost unnoticeable shifts. A child who once stayed silent now calmly disagrees. A partner who once explained themselves now simply says, "I'm not discussing this." A friend who once tolerated criticism now changes the subject or reduces contact. These moments may seem small, but for a narcissist, they represent something much bigger: loss of automatic influence. Earlier in life, control often worked because people depended on them. Financial dependence, family hierarchy, workplace authority, social reputation. These structures created an environment where disagreement had consequences. But time naturally changes these structures. Children become financially independent. Careers end with retirement. Social circles shrink or change. Health realities create vulnerability instead of dominance. And perhaps most importantly, people become emotionally wiser with age. Many people over 50 or 60 begin valuing peace more than approval. They become less interested in arguments they cannot win and less willing to participate in emotional chaos. This natural emotional evolution often removes the reaction narcissists depended on, because control requires reaction. If someone refuses to argue, control weakens. If someone refuses to defend themselves, manipulation weakens. If someone stops trying to please, guilt loses power. This is often deeply frustrating for a narcissist because they may increase the very behaviors that used to work. More criticism, more reminders of past sacrifices, more attempts to create guilt, more attempts to provoke emotional responses. But instead of restoring control, these behaviors often push people further toward emotional distance. Because what many narcissists fail to realize is this: control works best on people who still want your approval. When people stop needing approval, control begins to fail, and this is often the psychological turning point. Another major shift happens because aging naturally redistributes power in relationships. The narcissist may find themselves needing help rather than providing it. They may need emotional patience, medical support, or practical assistance. This reversal can feel extremely uncomfortable for someone who built identity around being dominant or self-sufficient. Needing help requires humility, and humility is often one of the hardest emotional skills for narcissistic personalities. So instead of asking gently, they may demand. Instead of expressing fear, they may complain. Instead of expressing vulnerability, they may become critical. These reactions are often attempts to hide the discomfort of losing control. But people usually respond very differently to demands than to vulnerability. Most people are willing to help someone who is kind. Fewer are willing to help someone who is entitled. Very few feel emotionally close to someone who makes them feel inadequate. So the narcissist may receive assistance but not warmth, support but not closeness, obligation but not affection. And this difference is deeply felt, even if never openly discussed. Another reason control stops working is because emotional boundaries become stronger with age. Many people who spent years tolerating difficult behavior eventually reach a quiet decision. I don't want my remaining years to feel stressful. This leads to simple but powerful changes: shorter visits, clearer limits, refusing certain conversations, not answering every call, not reacting to every criticism, choosing when to engage and when to disengage. These are not dramatic acts of rebellion. They are quiet acts of self-preservation. But to a narcissist, they can feel like loss of authority. And because narcissists often equate respect with obedience, they may interpret boundaries as disrespect rather than emotional maturity. This misunderstanding can create even more attempts at control. Statements like, "You've changed. You don't respect me anymore. After everything I've done." But what is really happening is something much simpler. People are no longer afraid of disappointing them. And without fear, control has very little foundation. Perhaps the hardest reality is that emotional influence cannot be forced in later life the way it sometimes could earlier. Wisdom, kindness, patience, and emotional safety become the real sources of influence. People naturally gravitate toward those who make them feel calm and accepted, and they naturally create distance from those who create tension. This is not revenge, this is emotional gravity, and it affects everyone the same way. For some narcissists, this stage creates anger. For others, sadness. For others, confusion, because they may genuinely not understand why the same behavior that once got results now gets resistance or silence. What they often cannot see is that time did not change the rules. Time just removed the advantages. And perhaps the most sobering truth is this: control was never the same thing as connection. Control can keep people near you, but only emotional safety keeps people close to you. And when control stops working, what remains is the emotional foundation that was built underneath it. If that foundation is weak, relationships may remain physically present but emotionally distant. This is why the later years often reveal a simple but powerful truth. People may stay where they are required, but they only stay emotionally where they feel safe. And when control fades, emotional truth is usually what remains. One of the quietest and most rarely discussed realities in the later life of a narcissistic personality is the presence of regret. Not always obvious regret, not always spoken regret, and often not even fully conscious regret. But something that shows up in indirect ways, in small comments, in certain memories they choose to revisit, and sometimes in the silence that follows when they realize certain relationships never became what they expected. Regret is complicated for narcissistic personalities because it requires something they have often spent a lifetime avoiding: honest self-reflection. To feel regret in a healthy way, a person must be able to say, "Maybe I was wrong," or "Maybe I hurt someone," or "Maybe I could have done something differently." But for someone whose identity depends on being right, strong, or superior, these thoughts can feel psychologically threatening. So instead of obvious regret, it often appears in disguised forms. Sometimes it appears as constant storytelling about the past, repeating stories of when they were respected, needed, or admired, talking about their sacrifices, their hard work, the things they provided. On the surface, this may sound like pride, but underneath, it can sometimes reflect a quiet question they may never ask directly. Why don't I feel that same importance now? Sometimes regret appears as comparison, watching other families that seem emotionally close, seeing adult children who call their parents just to talk, observing laughter that feels natural rather than careful. These moments may not lead to open admission, but they can create an uncomfortable awareness that something is missing. And instead of saying, "I wish I had been more emotionally available," a narcissist might say, "Families aren't like they used to be," or "Kids these days don't appreciate anything." This is often not intentional dishonesty, it is psychological protection, because accepting regret directly would require accepting responsibility. Another way regret sometimes appears is through late attempts at connection. A narcissistic parent who is emotionally distant may suddenly try to give advice more often. A partner who was critical may suddenly try to act more involved. Someone who rarely apologized may begin making small gestures of kindness that feel unfamiliar. These attempts may not come with explanation. They may not come with accountability, but they sometimes reflect a growing awareness that time is limited and relationships are not as secure as once assumed. The tragedy is that without direct emotional repair, these late attempts can feel confusing to the people receiving them. Without acknowledgement of the past, connection attempts may feel incomplete, because people often need validation of their experiences before they can fully trust new behavior. And narcissists often struggle to provide that validation because it requires emotional vulnerability, so the regret remains partially expressed but rarely fully resolved. Sometimes regret shows up in something even quieter: increased sensitivity. A narcissist who once seemed emotionally unaffected may begin reacting more strongly to perceived rejection. A delayed phone call may feel like proof of abandonment. A canceled visit may feel like disrespect. A short conversation may feel like neglect. This increased sensitivity is sometimes connected to the realization that relationships are no longer guaranteed by role alone. Being a parent, a spouse, or an elder no longer automatically ensures emotional closeness. Relationships begin reflecting emotional history rather than just titles, and this can create an uncomfortable awareness. Time invested in control does not always produce emotional return. Another form of regret can appear through rewriting history, remembering themselves as more supportive than they were, describing themselves as misunderstood rather than difficult, emphasizing intentions rather than impact. This is not always deliberate manipulation. Sometimes it is the mind's way of protecting a person from painful self-awareness. Because accepting the full emotional impact of decades of behavior can feel overwhelming, especially later in life when opportunities for repair may feel limited. But perhaps the deepest form of regret is not always about what they did. Sometimes it is about what they never allowed themselves to experience. Deep trust, emotional closeness, being loved without needing to be impressive, being accepted without needing to be right. Narcissistic defenses often protect against shame, but they also block these experiences. And later in life, some narcissists may begin to sense that while they may have achieved respect or fear, they may have missed something quieter but more meaningful: simple emotional warmth. And this awareness may never be spoken out loud. It may only appear in small ways: sitting quietly longer than usual, watching others connect, bringing up old memories more frequently, showing unexpected softness with grandchildren or animals where emotional risk feels lower. These moments sometimes reveal something important. Underneath defensive patterns, there is still a human being who wanted connection but did not know how to build it safely. And perhaps the most difficult truth is this: regret does not always come with the skills needed to repair what caused it. Because emotional repair requires humility, listening, and accountability. And if those skills were never developed, the awareness of regret can exist without the ability to fully act on it. So the regret may remain quiet, not dramatic, not confessed, not resolved, just felt. And maybe the most sobering lesson in this is not about narcissists themselves, but about human nature in general, that the things people regret most at the end of life are rarely about status, winning arguments, or being right. They are usually about moments of connection that were missed, words that were never softened, and relationships that could have been warmer if pride had been lighter. Because in the end, the hardest question is not, was I respected? It is often, was I emotionally safe to love?